The dust of Copper Creek settled like grief on everything it touched. Silas Boone rode into town with nothing but the weight of old ghosts and a single silver dollar burning a hole in his vest pocket, the last remnant of a life that had crumbled like desert sand through his fingers. The war had ended 7 years ago, but for men like Silas, it never truly finished. It lived in the tremor of his left hand when thunder rolled across the Arizona sky, in the way he startled awake each night reaching for a rifle that wasn't there, in the hollow ache where his heart used to be before Antietam took his faith and a Comanche raid took his family. He'd been drifting ever since, picking up work where he could find it, sleeping under stars that offered no comfort, trying to outrun memories that clung to him like his own shadow. Now, at 34, he felt ancient, worn down to bone and sinew and barely enough hope to keep breathing. Copper Creek was the kind of frontier town that attracted the desperate and the damned. A collection of weathered buildings squatting in the desert heat like tombstones marking the death of better intentions. The main street was a river of dust and horse manure, lined with saloons, a general store, and the kind of establishments that didn't advertise their business, but everyone knew their purpose. Silas tied his horse to a hitching post outside Murphy's trading post, his stomach growling with 3 days' worth of emptiness. Maybe Murphy would trade a day's work for a meal and a place to sleep. Maybe not. The world had grown stingy with its mercy. That's when he heard it, the sound that made his blood turn to ice water in his veins. An auctioneer's voice carried across the street from the town square, clear and businesslike. "Now here's a fine specimen. Gentlemen, young Apache squaw, maybe 17 or 18 years, strong as a Mustang and twice as spirited. Bidding starts at $5. Silas turned, and what he saw drove the air from his lungs like a kick to the chest. A wooden platform had been erected in the center of the square, and on it stood a young Apache woman in chains. Her dark hair hung in tangled waves past her shoulders, framing a face that might have been carved from stone for all the emotion it showed. She wore the remnants of a torn calico dress, probably forced on her to make her more presentable to white buyers. But it was her eyes that stopped Silas cold, black as midnight and burning with a hatred so pure it could melt steel. She was beautiful in the way a wildfire was beautiful, dangerous and untamed and utterly beyond any man's right to possess. Around the platform, a crowd of men had gathered like vultures, prospectors with gold dust on their fingers, ranch hands with cruelty etched in their faces, traders who saw flesh as just another commodity. They called out bids with the same casual interest they might show for livestock. $7, shouted a man in a stained bowler hat. 10, countered a bearded giant who looked like he wrestled bears for entertainment. The Apache woman, barely more than a girl, really stood perfectly still through it all, her chin raised in defiance even as iron shackles bit into her wrists and ankles. She didn't flinch when rough hands grabbed her jaw to show off her teeth, didn't cry out when they forced her to turn so the buyers could examine her from all angles like she was a horse being sold at market. But Silas saw the tremor that ran through her when one man reached out to touch her, saw the way her hands clenched into fists despite the chains. She was afraid, terrified, but she'd die before she'd show it to these animals. Something broke open inside Silas's chest, something that had been sealed shut since the day he'd buried his wife and daughter in the hard Oklahoma earth. A rage so pure and clean it made him dizzy. $15. The voice belonged to Jake Carver, a buffalo hunter known for his cruelty to both animals and people. Carver's eyes were fixed on the girl with an expression that made Silas's skin crawl. "I got plans for this little wildcat." The crowd laughed, the kind of laughter that made decent folks cross the street and pretend they hadn't heard. 15 going once, called the auctioneer. Silas looked down at his vest pocket, at the outline of his last silver dollar. One coin stood between him and starvation, between him and a roof over his head, between him and any chance of starting over somewhere else. The girl's eyes swept the crowd, and for just a moment, they met his. In that instant, he saw something that cut him deeper than any rebel bayonet. A flash of hope quickly smothered, a silent plea she was too proud to voice. "Going twice." The auctioneer raised his gavel. $20. The words came out of Silas's mouth before his brain could stop them. The crowd turned to stare at this hollow-eyed stranger who'd appeared from nowhere to outbid Jake Carver. Carver's face went dark as a thundercloud. 25, he snarled, his hand moving to rest on the knife at his belt. Silas felt his heart hammering against his ribs. $25 might as well have been 25,000. But he looked at the girl again, at the way she held herself like a queen even in chains, and something his dead wife used to say echoed in his memory. Sometimes a man has to choose between what's smart and what's right. He reached into his vest and pulled out a small leather pouch, the weight of it pathetic in his palm. "I got $20 in silver," he called out, his voice carrying farther than he'd expected. "And this," he held up a gold wedding ring, the last piece of his old life, the one thing he'd sworn never to part with. The crowd murmured. Gold was gold, even a simple band worn thin by years of honest labor. The auctioneer squinted at the ring. "That there's worth maybe 15, 20 more. Call it 40 total." Carver's eyes blazed, but $40 was more than most men in Copper Creek saw in a month. He opened his mouth to bid higher, then seemed to remember he was already reaching into money he didn't have. "Sold." The gavel came down with the finality of a coffin lid. "To the gentleman in the brown hat." The world seemed to tilt sideways. Silas walked through the crowd on unsteady legs, his hands shaking as he counted out his silver coins and placed his wedding ring, Sarah's ring, into the auctioneer's greedy palm. 21 years of marriage reduced to currency for buying a human being. The chain holding the girl's shackles was pressed into his hand like a leash. "She's all yours, mister," the auctioneer said with a grin that showed too many yellow teeth. "Got a bill of sale if you need it legal-like." Up close, the Apache woman was even more beautiful and more terrifying. She stared at him with those midnight eyes, her face a mask of contempt that seemed to burn right through his skin. When she spoke, her voice was low and musical, but the words were Apache, and he didn't need a translator to know they weren't friendly. "Easy there," he said quietly, making his voice as gentle as he could manage. "I'm not going to hurt you." Her only response was to spit at his feet. The crowd was starting to disperse, disappointed that the entertainment was over. Jake Carver pushed through the throng until he stood inches from Silas, close enough that Silas could smell whiskey and rotted teeth on his breath. "You made a mistake, stranger," Carver said, his voice a whiskey-roughened growl. "That little savage is more wildcat than woman. She'll gut you in your sleep first chance she gets." "Maybe," Silas replied evenly. "But that's my problem, not yours." Carver's hand moved to his knife again. "Everything in this town is my problem, friend, and I don't like being shown up by some saddle tramp with more money than sense." For a moment, the two men stared at each other, the weight of potential violence thick in the desert air. Silas was tired, bone-deep weary from years of running and hiding and trying to forget. But he'd been tired before, and Jake Carver wasn't the first bully he'd faced down. "Like I said," Silas repeated, his right hand resting casually near his Colt. "My problem." Something in his eyes must have convinced Carver that the price of pressing the matter might be higher than he wanted to pay. The buffalo hunter stepped back, but his expression promised the conversation wasn't over. "See you around, friend," Carver said, then melted back into the crowd. Silas turned to find the Apache woman watching the exchange with what might have been surprise. For just an instant, her mask slipped, and he caught a glimpse of the frightened girl beneath the warrior's facade. "Come on," he said gently, careful not to tug on the chain. "Let's get out of here." She said something else in Apache, still clearly unfriendly, but perhaps marginally less likely to involve his immediate death. As they walked through the dusty streets toward his horse, Silas wondered what in the hell he'd just done. He had no home, no money, no prospects, and now he was responsible for a young woman who probably knew 17 different ways to kill him with her bare hands. But when he looked at her walking beside him, head held high despite the chains, moving with the fluid grace of someone who'd never been truly conquered, He felt something he hadn't experienced in 7 long years. He felt like maybe, just maybe, he'd done something right. Silas's cabin sat at the edge of the world, where civilization gave up its pretense and the wilderness began in earnest. It was a simple structure, 4 walls of rough-hewn pine, a stone chimney that leaked smoke when the wind was wrong, and a single room that had housed his loneliness for the better part of 2 years. He'd built it with his own hands after drifting this far west, needing something solid between himself and the memories that followed him like hungry wolves. The Apache woman, he still didn't know her name, had maintained her stony silence during the hour-long ride from town. She sat behind him on his horse with the rigid posture of someone preparing for battle, her chained hands resting carefully so they wouldn't accidentally touch him. Every mile that passed seemed to coil her tighter, like a spring wound to its breaking point. When they reached the cabin, she slid down from the horse before he could offer help, landing on her feet with the fluid grace of a cat. Her dark eyes swept the clearing, taking in the woodpile, the small vegetable garden he'd been trying to coax from the stubborn soil, the creek that meandered past 50 yards away. He could see her mind working, cataloging escape routes and potential weapons. "It's not much," Silas said, dismounting and loosening his horse's girth. "But it's got a roof and 4 walls. Creek's good for drinking and washing." She turned those midnight eyes on him, and when she spoke, her English was accented but perfectly clear. "Why?" The single word hit him like a physical blow. After hours of silence, he'd almost convinced himself she didn't speak his language. "Why what? Why did you buy me?" Her voice was low, musical, but edged with something dangerous. "What do you want?" Silas set his saddle on the porch rail and considered the question. He'd been asking himself the same thing for the past hour, and he still didn't have a good answer. "I don't want anything from you," he said finally. "I saw what was happening back there, and I couldn't stomach it. That's all." She laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "White men always want something. They take our land, they kill our families, they sell us like cattle. You expect me to believe you are different? I expect you to believe what you see," he replied quietly. Nothing more, nothing less. He pulled a key from his pocket, the same key the auctioneer had given him along with the bill of sale, her eyes fixed on it with the intensity of a hawk watching prey. "I'm going to unlock those chains," he said, taking a careful step forward. "You can run if you want to. I won't stop you. But it's 40 miles to the nearest settlement, and Jake Carver's got friends who'd pay good money to bring you back. Your choice." She stood perfectly still as he approached, but he could feel the tension radiating from her like heat from a forge. When he knelt to unlock the shackles around her ankles, she was close enough that he could smell sage and cedar in her hair, could see the fresh rope burns on her wrists where the chains had rubbed. The ankle cuffs fell away with a metallic clatter. He moved to her wrists, and as the manacles opened, she jerked her hands back as if his touch burned. For a long moment, they stared at each other. She rubbed her wrists where the iron had chafed them raw, her eyes never leaving his face. "What is your name?" she asked. "Silas Boone." She nodded once, filing the information away. "I am Ayana," she said. "It means eternal blossom in my people's tongue, though there is little that blossoms in this place." "Ayana," he repeated, trying to get the pronunciation right. "It's a good name. And you, Silas Boone, are you a good man?" The question caught him off guard. "I don't know anymore," he said honestly. "I used to think I was." Something shifted in her expression, not quite softening, but a recognition of shared pain, perhaps. "The war," she said. It wasn't a question. Among other things. She walked to the edge of the porch and stared out at the mountains rising like purple shadows against the evening sky. "Your people killed mine at Sand Creek," she said quietly. "Women and children, flying white flags of peace. The soldiers cut them down like wheat." Silas felt something cold settle in his stomach. He'd heard the stories, tried not to believe them. "I wasn't there, but you were a soldier." "Yes, then you are my enemy." The words hung in the air between them, sharp as broken glass. Silas wanted to protest, to explain that he'd fought in a different war against different enemies, that he'd never raised a hand against her people. But what was the point? In her eyes, he was just another blue-coated destroyer, another white man who'd taken everything from her world. Maybe so, he said. Yeah. But you're free now. That has to count for something. She turned to face him, and her smile was bitter as winter wind. Free? I am alone in a world that wants to destroy me, protected by a man who may decide tomorrow that he paid good money and wants his investment back. You call this freedom? Before he could answer, she walked into the cabin without invitation. He heard her moving around inside, opening his few possessions to the scrutiny of someone who'd learned to survive by knowing everything about potential threats. By the time he followed her inside, she was examining his rifle with the practiced eye of someone who understood weapons. She set it down carefully and moved to the small shelf where he kept his books. A Bible, a volume of Shakespeare, a worn copy of Whitman's poetry that had somehow survived the war. You read, she observed, when I can't sleep, which is most nights. She pulled down the Bible and opened it to a random page. Do you believe in your white man's God? I used to. What changed? Silas walked to the fireplace and began building a fire, more for something to do with his hands than for warmth. I saw too much dying, good men, bad men, young men who'd never had a chance to be either. If there's a God watching over all this, he's got a strange sense of justice. The Apache believe the world is full of spirits, Ayanna said, settling cross-legged on his single chair with the unconscious grace of someone raised in the wild. Some good, some evil, most just indifferent. Perhaps your God is simply indifferent. They ate in relative silence, beans and hardtack, coffee that was more water than bean. She accepted the food without comment, but he noticed she ate like someone who'd learned not to trust where her next meal might come from. As full darkness settled over the mountains, he pulled blankets from his trunk and made a bed for her in the corner farthest from his own. She watched him work but made no comment. I'm a light sleeper, he said as he banked the fire. Fair warning, so am I. He lay down on his own bedroll, fully clothed with his gun within easy reach. For a long time, he listened to her breathing, waiting for the steady rhythm that would tell him she was asleep. It never came. She was as wakeful as he was. Two predators sharing an uneasy den. Sometime near midnight, he heard her rise. The floorboards creaked once, and then nothing. When he opened his eyes, she was gone. He found his boots and stepped outside. The moon was 3/4 full, bright enough to see by, and her tracks led toward the creek. He followed them, moving as quietly as years of hunting had taught him. She was 50 yards downstream, kneeling by the water's edge. At first he thought she was drinking, but then he saw her shoulders shaking and realized she was crying, silently, fiercely, the way someone cries who's learned that tears are a luxury that can get you killed. He started to retreat, to give her privacy, but a sound made him freeze, a low, sinister rattle from the rocks near where she knelt. Don't move, he called softly. She went rigid, and he could see the snake now, a big diamondback coiled on a boulder just 2 feet from where she knelt. The moonlight caught its scales like scattered coins. Very slowly, he whispered, drawing his knife. Stand up and step backward. She began to rise, moving with careful precision. The snake's rattle increased in tempo, its triangular head weaving hypnotically. For a moment, Silas thought she'd make it clear. Then her foot slipped on the wet rocks. She fell backward with a splash, and the rattlesnake struck like lightning. Ayanna cried out, the first sound of pain or fear he'd heard from her, and Silas was moving before conscious thought took over. He hit the water running, his knife flashing in the moonlight. The blade took the snake's head off in a single stroke, but the damage was already done. Blood ran dark down Ayanna's calf where the fangs had found their mark. How bad? He asked, scooping her up in his arms. Bad enough, she said through gritted teeth. Already her leg was beginning to swell. He carried her back to the cabin and laid her on his bed. then built up the fire until the room blazed with light. From his medical kit, a relic from his army days, he pulled out a bottle of whiskey and a sharp knife. "This is going to hurt," he warned. "Everything hurts," she replied. He made 2 quick cuts across the bite marks and bent to suck out as much venom as he could, spitting it into the fire where it hissed and sparked. She never made a sound, but her hand gripped his shoulder hard enough to leave bruises. When he'd done all he could, he bandaged the wound and forced her to drink some of the whiskey. She coughed and sputtered, but the alcohol would help fight the poison in her blood. "Why?" she asked, her voice already thick from the venom. "Why what? Why save me? I am your enemy, remember?" Silas pulled a chair beside the bed and settled in for what would likely be a long night. "Maybe," he said, "but you're also hurt, and I'm tired of watching people die." She studied his face in the firelight, and for the first time since he'd met her, her expression held something other than hatred or suspicion. "Tell me about your family," she said quietly. "Why?" "Because if I die tonight, I want to understand why you tried to save me." So he told her. About Sarah, his wife of 21 years, who'd had a laugh like silver bells and could make biscuits that would make angels weep. About Rebecca, their daughter, who'd been 16 and beautiful and planning to marry the minister's son come spring. About the Comanche raid that had taken them while he was away fighting someone else's war. "I came home to find their graves," he said, his voice steady but empty. "Sarah's wedding ring was the only thing left of value. The only thing I kept." Ayanna was quiet for a long time, her breathing labored but steady. "I had a brother," she said finally. "His name was Ahiga. He fights. The soldiers shot him while he tried to protect our grandmother. He was 12 years old." They sat in silence then, 2 damaged souls sharing the weight of their losses. Somewhere near dawn, her fever broke, and she fell into an exhausted sleep. Silas remained in the chair, keeping watch, wondering what strange current of fate had brought them together in this small cabin at the edge of nowhere. When she woke the next afternoon, the first words out of her mouth were, "I will not run." "All right," he said simply, "but I will not be your woman either. I never asked you to be." She studied him with those dark eyes, searching for deception and finding none. "Then what are we?" "Silas Boone." He considered the question, watching sunlight stream through the single window and dance across her face. "I suppose we're just 2 people trying to figure out how to live with what we've lost." For the first time since he'd met her, Ayanna almost smiled. "That," she said, "might be enough to start with." The journey began at first light on a Tuesday morning when autumn painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Silas had spent 3 days studying his worn map, plotting a route through the high country that would take them to the Apache territories without crossing too many settlements or well-traveled roads. The fewer people who saw them together, the better their chances of avoiding the kind of trouble that followed mixed-blood couples like a plague. Ayanna had recovered from the snake bite with the resilience of someone born to hardship, though she still favored her left leg slightly when she walked. She'd said little about their destination when he'd shown her the map, tracing the route with his finger across the faded paper. Her only comment had been, "It will be dangerous. Most worthwhile things are." He'd replied, "Now," as they loaded their meager supplies onto his horse. Silas felt the familiar weight of uncertainty settling on his shoulders. He was risking everything on the word of a half-breed trader who'd claimed there were still free Apache bands living in the high desert country of New Mexico territory. The man could have been lying, or simply wrong, but it was the only hope Ayanna had of finding her people, and therefore the only peace either of them might find. "You don't have to do this," she said as he secured the last of their supplies. Her voice was carefully neutral, but he caught the undercurrent of something deeper, not quite gratitude, but perhaps the beginning of trust. "Yes, I do," he said simply. They rode out as the sun cleared the eastern peaks, painting the world in long shadows and golden light. Silas had given her his spare pistol and seen how naturally it fit her hand, how her eyes automatically swept the terrain ahead for signs of danger. Whatever gentleness her people might have taught her about the sacred nature of life had been burned out of her by necessity. She was a survivor, pure and simple. The first 2 days passed without incident. They followed game trails through dense pine forests, climbed rocky switchbacks that made the horses blow hard in the thin air, and camped each night in hidden valleys where their fire couldn't be seen from below. Ayanna proved herself invaluable. She could read sign like a book, find water where Silas saw only dry stone, and move through the wilderness with a silence that made him feel clumsy as a buffalo by comparison. She was also beautiful in ways that made his chest ache with longing he had no right to feel. He tried not to watch her as she worked, but it was impossible not to notice the fluid grace of her movements, the way moonlight caught in her dark hair when she leaned over the fire, the quiet strength in her hands as she prepared their simple meals. She was nothing like Sarah. His wife had been soft and domestic, a woman who found her joy in hearth and home. Ayanna was wild storm and summer lightning, untamed as the wind itself. On the third evening, they made camp in a narrow canyon where red rock walls rose like cathedral spires around a hidden spring. Rain clouds had been building all afternoon, and as they finished their meal of rabbit and wild onions, the first fat drops began to fall. "Storm's coming hard," Silas observed, watching lightning flicker in the distance. Ayanna looked up at the darkening sky, her face troubled. "We need shelter. These canyons can flood without warning." They found a shallow cave cut into the rock face, barely deep enough for 2 people but dry. Silas gathered their gear while Ayanna coaxed their small fire back to life just inside the cave mouth. The rain began in earnest as they settled in. First a gentle patter, then a steady drumming that echoed off the canyon walls like distant thunder. In the close confines of the cave, Silas became acutely aware of her presence. Every breath brought the scent of sage and wood smoke that seemed to cling to her skin. When she moved to tend the fire, her shoulder brushed against his, and the contact sent electricity racing through his veins. "Your clothes are wet," he said, trying to keep his voice casual. She looked down at her dress, the same calico garment she'd been wearing when he bought her, now travel-stained and torn in places. "It will dry. You'll catch your death. I've got a spare shirt in my pack." For a moment, she seemed ready to refuse, pride warring with practicality. Then she shivered slightly as a cool breeze swept through the cave, and practicality won. "Turn around," she said simply. He did, staring out at the rain-lashed canyon while he listened to the rustle of fabric behind him. When she told him it was safe to turn back, she was wearing his blue wool shirt, the sleeves rolled up past her wrists, the hem falling almost to her knees. The sight hit him like a physical blow. She looked so small and vulnerable in his clothes, yet somehow more achingly beautiful than ever. That's when he saw them, the scars. They ringed her wrists like pale bracelets where the shackles had rubbed. But there were others too. Thin white lines across her forearms that spoke of desperate struggles, a puckered mark on her shoulder that looked like an old bullet wound. Her body was a map of survival, each scar a story of pain endured and overcome. Something broke inside his chest, a dam of careful control that had been holding back months of suppressed emotion. Before he could stop himself, he reached out and gently touched one of the scars on her wrist. She went rigid as a drawn bowstring, her eyes wide with something that might have been fear or rage or both. For a heartbeat, they stared at each other in the flickering firelight, the air between them charged with electricity that had nothing to do with the storm outside. "Don't," she whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. "I'm sorry," he said, but he didn't pull his hand away. "I'm so sorry for what was done to you." "Sorry changes nothing," she replied, but her voice was softer now, the edge of anger blunted by something else. "I know, but I needed to say it anyway." The rain pounded harder, turning the canyon into a river of sound. Lightning flashed, illuminating the cave entrance in stark black and white, and in that moment of brilliance, Silas saw his own reflection in her dark eyes, saw himself as she must see him, this broken white man who'd stumbled into her life like a lost soul seeking redemption. She pulled away from his touch and moved to the far side of the cave, wrapping her arms around herself. "You should not look at me that way," she said quietly. "What way?" "Like I am something precious that might break." "Aren't you?" She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I am Apache. We do not break, we bend. We adapt, we survive, but we do not break. Everyone breaks sometimes," Silas said gently. "It's what makes us human." For a long moment, the only sound was the rain drumming on stone and the soft crackle of their fire. Then, so quietly he almost didn't hear it over the storm, she spoke. "When they took me, I was gathering berries with my younger sister. The soldiers came out of nowhere, blue coats and brass buttons and faces like carved stone. They shot the men first, then rounded up the women and children like cattle." She stared into the fire as she spoke, her voice steady but distant, as if she were telling someone else's story. "My sister was only 14, beautiful and gentle, like a flower that blooms for one perfect day before the frost comes. One of the soldiers, he took her into the brush. I could hear her crying, begging them to stop. When they brought her back, there was no light left in her eyes." Silas felt his hands clench into fists, but he said nothing. This wasn't his story to interrupt with anger or sympathy. "She died 3 days later," Ayanna continued. "Just stopped breathing, like she decided living wasn't worth the pain anymore. And Her voice finally cracked. "Just a little. I couldn't save her, couldn't protect her, couldn't even comfort her properly because we were chained like animals." "It wasn't your fault," Silas said quietly. "Wasn't it?" She looked at him then, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I was the older sister. It was my job to keep her safe, and I failed." "You were a prisoner. There was nothing you could do." "There is always something you can do. You can fight, you can resist, you can die before you let them win." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, angry at herself for showing weakness. "Instead, I survived. I let them sell me like a piece of the livestock. And I survived." "Surviving isn't giving up," Silas said firmly. "Surviving is the hardest thing there is. It's choosing to keep breathing when everything inside you wants to quit. It's finding the strength to take one more step when your legs want to buckle. Don't you dare apologize for surviving." Something shifted in her expression. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition. "Is that what you tell yourself? When you wake up screaming in the night, dreaming of battles and burning houses?" The words hit him like a slap. "You hear that? I hear everything. You call out for Sarah sometimes. And Rebecca?" She tilted her head slightly, studying him with those dark eyes that seemed to see straight through his soul. "Tell me about them." So he did. He told her about coming home from the war to find his farm burned, his family dead, his entire world reduced to 2 crude wooden crosses in the red Oklahoma dirt. He told her about the guilt that ate at him like acid, the knowledge that he'd been off fighting someone else's war while his own family needed protection. He told her about the long, dark years that followed, drifting from town to town, trying to outrun memories that clung to him like shadows. "I keep thinking if I'd been there, if I'd stayed home instead of marching off to play soldier, maybe I could have saved them," he said finally. "And maybe you would have died with them," Ayanna replied. "Or maybe you would have been away hunting, or in town for supplies, or any of 1,000 other things. You cannot know. But I should have been there." "Yes," she said simply. "You should have been, just as I should have been able to protect my sister. But we are here, and they are not, and all we can do is carry their memories forward and try to honor them with how we choose to live." The storm was beginning to ease, the drumming of rain on stone giving way to a gentler patter. The fire had burned low, casting the cave in warm, dancing shadows. Somewhere in the distance, a night bird called out. It sung lonely and haunting. "What was her name?" Silas asked. "Your sister." "Aponi. It means butterfly in our language. She was always chasing butterflies when she was little, trying to catch them in her hands." Ayanna smiled at the memory, the expression transforming her face entirely. Our grandmother used to say she had the spirit of a butterfly, too beautiful and free to be captured for long. She sounds wonderful. She deserved better than what happened to her. So did Sarah and Rebecca. So did all of them. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, two damaged souls sharing the weight of their grief. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing the desert clean and filling the air with the sweet scent of sage and creosote. "Silas," Ayanna said softly. "Yes? Thank you for listening, for not trying to tell me it will get easier, or that God has a plan, or any of the other meaningless things people say when they don't know what else to do with pain." "Pain is just pain," he replied. "It doesn't need to mean anything beyond what it is." She moved closer to the fire, close enough that he could see the reflected flames dancing in her eyes. "When we reach my people, if we reach them, what will you do then?" The question he'd been avoiding thinking about. "I don't know. Find somewhere else to go, I suppose. Maybe California. I hear a man can start over there." "You could come with us." The words hung in the air between them like a bridge neither quite dared to cross. The implications were staggering. A white man living among the Apache, sharing their struggles, their hunted existence. It would mean giving up any pretense of rejoining civilized society, of ever having a normal life again. "Your people wouldn't want me," he said. "Some wouldn't, others might. We are not all the same, any more than all white men are the same. And you? What do you want?" She was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I want to stop running. I want to wake up in the morning without wondering if this is the day someone will put me back in chains. I want—" She paused, searching for words. "I want to remember what it feels like to trust someone. You can trust me." "Can I?" She looked at him directly, her gaze intense and searching. "Even when it would be easier to sell me again? Even when staying with me means you can never go back to the white world?" "I don't want to go back," Silas said, and realized as he said it that it was true. "There's nothing for me there anymore." The fire popped, sending sparks spiraling up toward the cave entrance. Rain continued to fall outside, but gentler now, more promise than threat. Dawn was still hours away, but Silas felt as if something fundamental had shifted between them in this small stone shelter. Some barrier had been crossed, some understanding reached. "We should try to sleep," Ayanna said finally. "Tomorrow will be harder. The high passes are treacherous even in good weather." She settled down on her side of the cave, using her wadded-up dress as a pillow. Silas banked the fire and lay down as well, but sleep seemed as distant as the stars hidden behind storm clouds. "Ayanna," he said softly. "Yes? Whatever happens when we reach your people, I want you to know, buying you wasn't about ownership. It was about giving you back the choice that had been taken away." "I know," she whispered back. "That's why I trust you." Later, as the rain finally stopped and the first pale hint of dawn crept into the eastern sky, Silas woke to find she had moved closer to him in her sleep. Her hand rested on his arm, her face peaceful in slumber, and for the first time in years, he felt something that might have been hope stirring in his chest. The journey to find her people would be dangerous, perhaps impossible, but lying there in the gray pre-dawn light, listening to her breathe. Silas knew with absolute certainty that he would follow her to the ends of the earth if that's what it took to keep her safe, even if it meant losing himself completely in the process. They had been traveling for 8 days when they crested a ridge and saw the valley spread below them like a wound carved into the earth's flesh. What should have been a sacred place, Ayanna had told him it was called the Valley of Dancing Waters in her people's tongue, now lay before them, transformed into something obscene. The natural hot springs that had once been a place of healing and ceremony were now choked with mining equipment. Sluice boxes ran like scars down the hillsides, and the creek that had given the valley its name ran thick with mud and debris from the silver mine that had eaten into the mountain's heart like a cancer. The ancient cottonwoods where her people had hung their prayer offerings were gone, replaced by rough mining shacks and equipment sheds. Silas felt Ayanna go rigid behind him on the horse, her hands tightening on his waist. When he turned to look at her, her face had gone pale as winter bone. "This was our most sacred place," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Where the spirits came to earth to dance with our ancestors, where young women came to seek visions of their futures, where the sick came to be healed by the sacred waters." Below them, a crew of miners worked the claim with the methodical efficiency of ants, their picks and shovels ringing against stone in a rhythm that sounded like a funeral dirge. Smoke from their fires hung in the valley like a gray shroud, and the smell of sulfur and unwashed bodies drifted up on the afternoon breeze. "We'll go around," Silas said quietly. "Find another route." But Ayanna was already sliding down from the horse, her feet hitting the ground with the soft thud of someone who had made a decision that couldn't be unmade. She walked to the edge of the overlook and stood there, her dark hair streaming in the wind, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "They took everything," she said, and for the first time since he'd known her, her voice broke completely. "Our hunting grounds, our winter camps, our burial places, and now this, the heart of our world, turned into that." She gestured at the valley below with a movement full of rage and despair. Then, without warning, she threw back her head and screamed, a sound of such primal anguish that it seemed to shake the very stones beneath their feet. The cry echoed off the canyon walls, bouncing back and forth until it sounded like the wail of 100 ghosts. Birds exploded from the trees in a thunder of wings. Far below, some of the miners looked up, shading their eyes against the sun, but they were too distant to make out anything more than shadows on the rim rock. When the echo finally died away, Ayanna collapsed to her knees as if the scream had taken the last of her strength. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs, and Silas felt his heart break watching her, this strong, proud woman brought low by the weight of her people's destruction. He knelt beside her and, after a moment's hesitation, put his arms around her. This time, she didn't pull away. Instead, she turned into his embrace like a child seeking comfort from a nightmare, her face buried against his shoulder as years of suppressed grief finally found its voice. "I'm sorry," he murmured into her hair, knowing the words were inadequate but needing to say them anyway. "I'm so damn sorry." They stayed that way as the sun tracked across the sky and the shadows lengthened around them. Slowly, gradually, her sobs subsided, replaced by the kind of exhausted quiet that comes after a fever breaks. When she finally pulled back to look at him, her eyes were red-rimmed but clear. "You must think me weak," she said, wiping her face with the back of her hand. "I think you're the strongest person I've ever met," he replied honestly. "And I think you've been carrying this pain alone for too long." She studied his face in the fading light, and something shifted in her expression. A wall coming down, perhaps, or a door opening that had been locked for too long. "Will you stay with me tonight?" she asked softly. "Here, overlooking what was once beautiful. I don't want to be alone with the ghosts." They made camp on the ridge in a grove of piñón pines, far enough from the valley edge that they couldn't see the mining operation, but close enough that the sound of falling water from the desecrated springs still reached them on the night wind. Silas built a small fire while Ayanna gathered sage and sweetgrass, which she burned with whispered words in her own language, prayers for the dead, he suspected, or perhaps forgiveness for the living. As full darkness settled over the mountains, she began to speak, not about the valley below or the destruction it represented, but about what it had been before. She told him about summer gatherings when all the scattered bands would come together to trade and feast and tell stories under the stars. She described the healing ceremonies conducted in the hot springs, where the sick and wounded would emerge from the sacred waters renewed in body and spirit. She painted pictures with her words of young warriors proving their courage, of children learning the old songs, of elders sharing wisdom around fires that had burned in that place for countless generations. "It was paradise," she said simply, "and now it's gone forever." "Maybe not forever," Silas said. "Mines play out eventually. The silver won't last indefinitely." She shook her head. "The damage is already done. The spirits that lived in those waters are fled or dead. The sacred trees are cut down. Even if the miners left tomorrow, it would take generations for the land to heal, if it ever could. They sat in silence for a while, watching sparks from their fire spiral up toward the stars. An owl called somewhere in the darkness, its voice lonely and mournful. The night was clear and cold, with that crystalline quality that comes with high altitude and thin air. "Silas," Ayanna said eventually. "Yes? When you look at me, what do you see?" The question caught him off guard. "What do you mean? Do you see an Apache woman, a savage, a curiosity, something exotic and forbidden?" He considered the question carefully, knowing that his answer mattered more than perhaps any words he'd ever spoken. "I see someone who's survived things that would have broken most people," he said finally. "Someone who's beautiful not because of how she looks, but because of who she is, strong and fierce and brave and kind. Even after the world gave her every reason to be otherwise, I see." He paused, searching for the right words. "I see the person I want to be better for." Her breath caught slightly. "That's not an answer to my question." "Yes, it is. When I look at you, I don't see Apache or white or any of those things that are supposed to matter so much. I just see Ayanna." She was quiet for so long he thought he might have said the wrong thing. Then she moved closer to him, close enough that he could see firelight reflected in her dark eyes. "When I was a little girl," she said softly, "my grandmother used to tell me stories about the spirit world. She said that sometimes, when two souls had been wounded in the same way, they would find each other across great distances and help each other heal. She called them twin flames, not because they were the same, but because they burned with the same light. Do you believe that?" "I didn't, not until—" She reached out and touched his face, her fingers tracing the lines that years of pain had carved around his eyes. "Not until I met a broken white man who spent his last dollar to buy freedom for a stranger." The space between them seemed to crackle with electricity. Silas felt his heart hammering against his ribs as she leaned closer, her breath warm against his cheek. "Ayanna," he whispered, but he wasn't sure if it was a question or a prayer. "I know all the reasons this is impossible," she said quietly. "I know what it would mean, what people would say, what it would cost us both. But I also know that I've been dead inside since the day they took my sister. And for the first time in years, I feel like I might be alive again." "Are you sure?" Instead of answering with words, she kissed him. It was soft and tentative at first, like someone testing the temperature of unknown waters. But when he kissed her back, something ignited between them, all the longing and loneliness and desperate need for connection that they'd both been carrying like stones in their hearts. He pulled her closer, his hands tangling in her dark hair, and she came willingly, pressing herself against him with an urgency that spoke of years of denial and suppressed desire. The kiss deepened, became hungrier, more desperate, as if they were both trying to pour everything they couldn't say into this single moment of connection. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. The fire popped and hissed beside them, casting dancing shadows across their faces. "This changes everything," Silas said quietly. "I know. There's no going back from this." "I don't want to go back," she replied, her voice steady and sure. "I'm tired of running from what I feel. Tired of pretending I don't need anyone, don't want anyone. The world has taken so much from both of us. Why should we let it take this too?" She began to unbutton his shirt with hands that trembled only slightly, her eyes never leaving his face. He caught her wrists gently. "Are you certain about this? Once we cross this line, I've never been more certain of anything in my life." She said, "Have you?" He looked into her eyes and saw no doubt there. No fear, only desire and trust and something that might have been love beginning to bloom. The logical part of his mind cataloged all the reasons this was madness, the racial divide that society would never accept, the danger it would put them both in, the impossibility of any kind of future together. But for once in his life, Silas decided to listen to his heart instead of his head. "No," he said simply, never more certain. They came together under the vast western sky with a passion born of shared loss and hard-won trust. There was nothing hurried or desperate about it. They moved together with the careful reverence of people who understood that such moments were rare and precious, to be savored rather than rushed. Her skin was warm bronze silk beneath his hands, marked with those scars that told the story of her survival. He traced each one gently with his lips, offering wordless comfort for old wounds. When she cried out softly, it wasn't from pain, but from the overwhelming relief of being touched with tenderness rather than violence, of being desired rather than owned. Afterward, they lay entwined by the dying fire, her head pillowed on his shoulder, their breathing slowly returning to normal. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the small human drama playing out beneath them. "What happens now?" Ayanna asked quietly. "I don't know," Silas admitted. "But whatever it is, we'll face it together." She raised her head to look at him, and in the starlight her face was beautiful beyond description. "Together," she repeated, as if testing the word. "I like the sound of that." "So do I." She settled back against him with a contented sigh, and for the first time in years, Silas felt something approaching peace. The morning would bring new challenges, new dangers, new impossible choices. But for now, in this moment, they had found something worth fighting for in each other. "Silas, thank you for seeing me, not what I am or where I come from, but who I am." "Thank you for letting me," he replied, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. Far below them, the desecrated valley slept under its shroud of industrial shame. But here, on this ridge under the infinite stars, two wounded souls had found a way to begin healing each other, and perhaps, in the process, had discovered that love could bloom even in the most unlikely soil. The sacred springs might be poisoned, but the human heart, Silas reflected as sleep began to claim him, was remarkably resilient. Sometimes, in the darkest places, the most beautiful things could still take root and grow, even if the world insisted such things were impossible. From the sacred valley, their route led into the heart of the Sonoran Desert, a landscape so harsh and unforgiving that even the Apache avoided it during the summer months. But autumn was dying now, and winter's touch was beginning to soften the brutal edge of the wasteland. Still, as they descended from the pine-covered mountains into a world of saguaro cactus and creosote bush, Silas felt as if they were entering the antechamber of hell itself. The change was gradual at first. The tall pines gave way to scrub oak, then to juniper and pinon, and finally to the strange, alien landscape of the desert floor. Here, the very air seemed to shimmer with heat even in the cooler months, and every plant was armed with thorns or spines or some other defense against a world that offered no mercy to the weak. Their water ran low on the third day. Silas had thought he'd calculated their supplies carefully, but the desert air sucked moisture from their bodies like a vampire, and their 2 canteens, which had seemed adequate in the mountains, now felt pitifully insufficient. By noon, they were rationing their remaining water to small sips that barely wet their throats. "There's a spring marked on the map," Silas said, studying the worn paper with eyes that watered from the glare. "Maybe 10 miles southwest." Ayanna shaded her eyes with her hand and stared across the shimmering wasteland. "Maps lie in the desert," she said quietly. "Springs dry up, landmarks shift. The desert keeps its own counsel." But they had no choice except to press on. The alternative was to turn back, and they'd already come too far for that to be feasible. So they rode deeper into the furnace, their horse plodding through sand that seemed to grab at its hooves like quicksand, while the sun hammered down from a sky the color of beaten copper. By evening, they still hadn't found the spring. Worse, Ayanna had begun showing signs of heat exhaustion, her skin flushed and dry, her breathing shallow and rapid. She insisted she was fine, but Silas could see the way she swayed in the saddle, could hear the rasp in her voice when she spoke. They made camp in the shadow of a massive boulder that provided a few precious degrees of relief from the residual heat radiating from the desert floor. There was no wood for a fire, no game to hunt, even if there had been. They shared the last of their jerky and a few sips of increasingly precious water, then lay down on their blankets to wait for dawn. "Tell me about the ocean," Ayanna whispered in the darkness. "I've never seen it," Silas admitted. "Neither have I, but I dream about it sometimes, all that water, stretching to the horizon, cool and blue and endless." Her voice was dreamy, almost delirious. "Do you think we'll ever see it?" "Yes," he lied, because the truth that they might not live to see another sunset if they didn't find water soon was too heavy for the desert night. "Someday, we'll stand on a beach and watch the waves roll in." She smiled at that, a ghost of her usual radiance. "I'd like that." She fell asleep soon after, but her rest was fitful, plagued by fever dreams that made her mumble in Apache and toss restlessly on her blanket. Silas lay awake listening to her labored breathing, feeling helplessness gnaw at him like acid. He'd survived a war, built a life from nothing, endured losses that should have killed him, but none of it had prepared him to watch the woman he loved slowly dying of thirst in his arms. When dawn came, painting the desert in shades of rose and gold that would have been beautiful under other circumstances, Ayanna could barely sit up. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, her eyes sunken with dehydration. "Leave me," she whispered when he tried to help her stand. "Take the horse and go. Find water and come back if you can." "Like hell," he said, scooping her up in his arms. "We started this together. We'll finish it together." She was lighter than she should have been, her body already consuming itself in its desperate need for moisture. He lifted her onto the horse and climbed up behind her, supporting her weight against his chest as they resumed their torturous progress across the wasteland. The sun climbed higher, and with it, the temperature. The horse began to stumble, its breathing labored, foam flecking its muzzle. Vultures appeared as if from nowhere, circling overhead with the patient malevolence of undertakers. That's when Silas saw it, a slight depression in the desert floor about a quarter-mile to their left, marked by a cluster of Palo Verde trees that looked suspiciously green for this parched landscape. "There," he croaked, his voice barely audible through his swollen throat. They rode toward the depression, hope and desperation warring in Silas's chest. As they drew closer, he could see that the trees were indeed healthier than they should be in this wasteland, their bark showing the telltale signs of subsurface moisture. The spring itself was nothing more than a damp spot in the sand, the water table too low to create an actual pool. But it was there, precious, life-giving moisture seeping up through the desert floor like a miracle made manifest. Silas half fell from the horse and began digging with his bare hands, scooping away sand with desperate efficiency. 6 inches down, he hit dampness. A foot down, muddy water began to seep into the hole he'd created. It was brackish and gritty, more mud than water, but it was wet. He cupped his hands and brought the precious liquid to Ayanna's lips, watching her drink in small, careful sips. Color began to return to her face, and her eyes focused on his with something approaching their usual sharpness. "More," she whispered. He dug the hole deeper, wider, until he had a pool nearly 2 feet across. The water that seeped in was clearer now, though still far from pure. They drank their fill, then refilled their canteens and watered the horse, which thrust its muzzle into the muddy pool and drank as if it would never stop. As the immediate crisis passed, Silas became aware of how close they'd come to dying. Another day, maybe less, and the desert would have claimed them both. The thought made him dizzy with relief and retroactive terror. "We can't stay here," Ayanna said, reading his thoughts. "This water won't last, and there are other things in the desert that know about this place." As if to emphasize her point, they heard the distant howl of coyotes, or perhaps something worse. The desert's predators would be drawn to any source of water, and 2 humans and a horse would make tempting prey for creatures desperate enough. They rested through the worst heat of the day, rationing their renewed water supply and trying to recover their strength. As evening approached, Silas consulted his map again, plotting a course toward the next possible water source. According to the faded ink, there should be a trading post another 20 miles southeast, assuming it still existed, assuming the map was accurate, assuming a dozen other variables that could mean the difference between life and death. We leave at sunset, he decided. Travel through the night when it's cooler. Ayanna nodded, her eyes already clearer, her movements more coordinated. The Apache were desert people. After all, she would recover faster than he would from their brush with dehydration. As they prepared to continue their journey, she caught his arm and pulled him close. "You could have left me," she said quietly. It would have been the smart thing to do, the practical thing. "I don't love practical things," he replied, pressing his forehead against hers. "I love you." It was the first time either of them had spoken the word aloud, and it hung in the desert air between them like a promise and a prayer. "And I love you," she whispered back, "more than I thought it was possible to love anyone again." They set out as the sun touched the western horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. The desert at twilight was a different creature entirely, cooler, more mysterious, full of hidden life that emerged only when the killing heat retreated. Night-blooming cereus opened their pale flowers to catch the evening breeze. And somewhere, in the darkness, a great horned owl called to its mate. They rode through the night, stopping only to rest the horse and sip sparingly from their canteens. The stars wheeled overhead in patterns Ayanna read like a map, guiding them through a landscape that looked identical in every direction to Silas's untrained eyes. Dawn found them on a low ridge, overlooking a sight that made Silas's heart sink. Below them, scattered across a mile of desert floor, lay the remnants of what had once been a trading post. Adobe walls had crumbled back into the earth from which they'd come. Wooden beams lay bleached and splintered in the sand, and the well that should have provided water was nothing but a dry hole filled with tumbleweeds and the bones of small animals. "How long?" Ayanna asked. "Years," Silas said, studying the ruins. "Maybe decades." Their last hope of easy water was gone, swallowed by the desert's indifferent hunger. According to the map, the next marked water source was 40 miles away, too far to reach with their current supplies. But as they sat on the ridge contemplating their options, Ayanna suddenly stiffened. "Riders," she said, pointing toward a dust cloud on the eastern horizon. "Coming this way?" Silas shaded his eyes and counted the dust trails. 4, maybe 5 horses, moving fast. They watched in tense silence as the riders approached the ruins of the trading post. Even at a distance, there was something predatory about the way they moved, something that set every survival instinct Silas possessed on high alert. "Slavers," Ayanna breathed, her voice tight with fear. "Mexican traders who deal in human cargo. They must have been tracking us." The riders had spread out now, circling the ruins like hunters surrounding prey. One of them, a man in a broad-brimmed hat and silver-decorated jacket, dismounted and began examining the ground around the old well. Even from their position on the ridge, Silas could see him pointing at tracks, coordinating his men for a search. "They know we were here," Silas said grimly. "They know more than that." Ayanna replied, "See the way they're moving? They're not just following our trail. They're trying to predict where we'll go next. They know this country, know where the water sources are." The implications were clear. The slavers could afford to be patient, to drive them deeper into the desert where thirst and exhaustion would do most of the work for them. All they had to do was wait for their prey to collapse, then collect the bounty. "There," Ayanna said suddenly, pointing toward the lead rider. "The one in the silver jacket. I know him. Carlos Mendoza. He was at the auction where you bought me, bidding on some of the other women. He specializes in Apache females, sells them to brothels in Mexico City." Silas felt a cold rage settle in his chest. "Well, he can't have you." "He won't take me alive?" Ayanna said quietly, her hand moving to the knife at her belt. "I won't go back to chains. Not ever." "It won't come to that," Silas promised. But even as he said it, he was calculating odds and finding them wanting. 5 armed men against 2 exhausted travelers with limited ammunition and no knowledge of the local terrain. It wasn't a fight they could win through force. Below them, Mendoza had remounted and was directing his men to fan out in a search pattern. It was only a matter of time before they picked up the trail again. "We run," Silas decided. "Hard and fast, deeper into the desert. Make them work for it. They have fresh horses and full water supplies," Ayanna pointed out. "Running will only delay the inevitable. Then we make our stand," Silas said grimly, checking his rifle. "Choose our ground and make them pay for it." But Ayanna was already shaking her head. "No, there's another way." She pointed toward a rocky outcropping about 2 miles to the south. "Those formations, they're riddled with caves and hidden passages. My people used them for centuries to escape enemies. If we can reach them, it's worth a try." Silas agreed. They began their descent from the ridge, moving as quickly as stealth would allow. Behind them, the search was intensifying. They could hear shouts as the slavers found clearer sign of their passage. The race was on, and the prize was nothing less than their lives and freedom. As they rode toward the rocky sanctuary, Silas found himself thinking not of the danger behind them, but of the woman pressed against his back. Whatever happened in the next few hours, he regretted nothing. Finding Ayanna, loving her, fighting for her. It had given meaning to a life that had been empty for too long. Even if the desert claimed them both, at least they would die together, as they had chosen to live. Free. The rocky outcropping rose from the desert floor like the spine of some ancient, buried giant. As they drew closer, Silas could see that Ayanna had been right. The red sandstone was honeycombed with caves and crevices, carved by centuries of wind and flash floods into a natural labyrinth that could hide an army. Behind them, the dust cloud raised by their pursuers was growing larger. The slavers had found their trail and were closing the distance with the methodical persistence of men who knew their business. Silas estimated they had perhaps 20 minutes before Mendoza and his riders reached the rocks. "There!" Ayanna pointed to a narrow cleft in the stone wall about halfway up the formation. "That leads to a larger cave system. We can hide the horse there." They rode hard for the rocks, their mounts' hooves striking sparks from the stone as they climbed a winding path that seemed more suited to mountain goats than horses. The animal was exhausted, its sides heaving, but it gamely continued upward until they reached the hidden entrance Ayanna had spotted. The cleft was barely wide enough for a horse, but it opened into a larger chamber beyond, a natural cave with a sandy floor and walls worn smooth by ages of water flow. Ancient pictographs covered the stone surfaces, telling stories in red ochre and charcoal that stretched back to the dawn of human habitation in this harsh land. "My people have used this place for generations," Ayanna said softly, running her fingers over one of the painted figures. "Warriors fleeing cavalry patrols, families escaping slave raids, hunters waiting out sandstorms. The spirits of my ancestors walk here." Silas felt the weight of history in the cool air of the cave, the sense of countless human dramas that had played out in this natural sanctuary. He hoped it would prove as protective for them as it had for those who had come before. They led the horse deeper into the cave system, following a winding passage that eventually opened onto a hidden valley completely enclosed by towering walls of stone. A spring bubbled up from the rocks at the far end, creating a small oasis of grass and desert willows. It was like finding paradise in the heart of hell. "Water," Silas breathed, hardly believing their luck. "And feed for the horse," Ayanna added, gesturing to the grass. "We could hold out here for weeks if necessary." But even as she spoke, they could hear the sound of approaching riders echoing off the canyon walls outside. The slavers had reached the rock formation and were beginning their search. "Carlos is persistent," Ayanna said grimly. "He won't give up easily, and he has Apache trackers working for him. Men who know these formations as well as I do. Then we make sure they don't find us," Silas replied, checking his rifle and pistol. "How many ways into this valley?" "3 that I know of. The passage we came through, a narrow chimney on the north wall that's barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through, and a hidden tunnel that leads to the main cave system." "Can you get to the other entrances without being seen?" She nodded. "There are connecting passages." "Why?" "Because if they find us, I want to know about it before they're breathing down our necks." Ayana slipped away into the shadows like a ghost, moving with the silent grace of someone raised in this unforgiving landscape. Silas remained with the horse, keeping it calm and quiet while listening to the sounds of the search party outside. Voices echoed strangely in the rock formations, making it difficult to determine exactly where the riders were or how close they might be getting. An hour passed, then two. The sun climbed higher, turning the hidden valley into a furnace despite the shade provided by the towering walls. Silas was beginning to hope that the slavers had given up the search when Ayana materialized beside him like smoke. "They found our tracks leading into the main passage," she whispered. "2 men are coming through the tunnel system on foot. The others are watching the exterior entrances. How long do we have?" "Minutes, maybe less." Silas made a quick decision. "Take the horse and head for that chimney you mentioned. Get out of here. I'm not leaving you." "Ayana, listen to me." "No." Her eyes blazed with determination. "We face this together or not at all." Before he could argue further, they heard voices echoing from the tunnel entrance. The searchers had found their way into the cave system. "This way," Ayana whispered, leading him toward a jumble of boulders at the base of the north wall. "There's a hiding place my brother and I used as children." They squeezed between 2 massive stones into a natural alcove that was invisible from the valley floor. It was cramped and airless, but it provided complete concealment as long as they remained perfectly still. The voices grew louder. 2 men emerged from the tunnel entrance, moving cautiously with weapons drawn. One was Mexican, dressed in the elaborate leather and silver of a professional gunfighter. The other made Silas's blood run cold. An Apache man, probably in his 40s, with the weathered face and steady eyes of a seasoned tracker. "Fresh sign," the Apache said in accented English, kneeling by the spring where their horse had drunk. "They were here within the last hour." "Where did they go?" the Mexican asked, scanning the valley walls nervously. The tracker studied the ground with the intensity of a scholar reading ancient texts. He followed their footprints to where they'd led the horse, then lost the trail where the stone floor began. For long minutes, he quartered back and forth like a hunting dog, searching for some sign of their passage. Silas held his breath as the man approached their hiding place. Through a gap between the stones, he could see the tracker's face clearly. The concentration, the professional pride, the grim satisfaction of a man who was very good at his job. The Apache stopped not 3 feet from their concealment and tilted his head, listening. Silas could feel his heart hammering so loudly he was certain it would give them away. Beside him, Ayana was statue still, barely breathing, after what felt like an eternity. The tracker straightened and shook his head. "They're not here anymore," he said. "Must have gone back through the passages." "Are you sure?" the Mexican pressed. "Carlos will have our hides if we let them slip away again." "I'm sure. The trail leads back toward the main caves. They probably heard us coming and doubled back." The 2 men headed toward the tunnel entrance, their voices fading as they disappeared into the stone labyrinth. Silas and Ayana remained motionless for another 10 minutes, listening for any sound that might indicate the searchers were returning. "Finally," Ayana whispered, "they're gone." They emerged from their hiding place, muscles cramped from the enforced stillness. The hidden valley seemed even more like paradise now that they'd nearly lost it. "Your people are good trackers," Silas observed. "That one is better than good," Ayana replied, her voice troubled. "I know him. His name is Joseph Crowfeather. He used to hunt with my father before the soldiers scattered our band. He's tracking us for money now, but once he was one of the best warriors of our people." "What turned him?" "The same thing that turns most of us. Desperation. When you're watching your children starve, you do what you must to keep them alive, even if it means hunting your own people for Mexican silver." They waited through the heat of the day, taking turns keeping watch while the other rested. As evening approached, they could hear the search party regrouping outside the rock formation. Voices carried on the still air, frustrated, angry voices that spoke of a long, fruitless day. "We'll make camp here tonight," they heard Mendoza say. "Post guards on all the main passages. If they're still in these rocks, they'll have to come out eventually. And when they do, we'll be waiting." The implications were clear. The slavers were settling in for a siege, confident that thirst and hunger would eventually drive their quarry into the open. It was a sound strategy, except for the existence of the hidden valley with its life-giving spring. As full darkness fell, Ayanna slipped away again to scout the enemy positions. She returned an hour later with disturbing news. "They've blocked all the main exits," she reported. "Guards posted with clear fields of fire, but I found something else. Crowfeather is camped alone, away from the others. I think Mendoza doesn't fully trust him." "Smart man, considering," Silas said grimly. "There's more. I got close enough to hear him talking to himself, or maybe to the spirits of our ancestors. He's having second thoughts about this hunt." What kind of second thoughts? The kind that come to a man when he realizes he's betrayed everything he once believed in for a handful of silver coins. They discussed their options in whispered conference. They could try to break out through one of the lesser-known passages, but that would mean abandoning the horse and striking out across the desert on foot with limited supplies. They could wait and hope the slavers grew impatient and moved on. But Mendoza seemed like a man with infinite patience when money was involved. Or they could try something desperate and probably suicidal. "I'm going to talk to Crowfeather," Ayanna announced. "That's insane," Silas protested. "He's working for them. He'll turn you over to Mendoza the moment he sees you." "Maybe. Or maybe he's as tired of this life as I think he is." "It's too dangerous. Everything we've done since the day you bought me has been dangerous," she replied calmly. "But sometimes you have to take a leap of faith and trust that the spirits will catch you." Before Silas could stop her, she had melted back into the shadows, leaving him alone with his fears and the steady sound of water dripping from the spring. All he could do was wait and pray to whatever gods might be listening that the woman he loved wasn't walking into a trap that would destroy them both. The night stretched endlessly, filled with the distant sounds of the slavers' camp and the closer, more terrifying silence that surrounded Ayanna's mission. Silas checked and rechecked his weapons, planned and replanned their escape routes, and tried not to think about what might be happening in the darkness beyond the hidden valley. He was so focused on listening for sounds of trouble that he almost missed the soft footfall that announced her return. She appeared at the tunnel entrance like a spirit materializing from the stone itself, and the expression on her face sent his heart racing with hope and terror in equal measure. "It's done," she said simply. "What's done?" "I offered Joseph Crowfeather a choice, gold or redemption. He chose redemption." Before Silas could ask what that meant, they heard the first shouts of alarm from the slavers' camp. Then gunfire, sharp, rapid reports that echoed off the canyon walls like thunder. In the distance, men were yelling in Spanish and English, their voices high with confusion and panic. "What did you do?" Silas asked. Ayanna's smile was fierce and beautiful in the moonlight. "I reminded a warrior what it means to fight for his people instead of against them." The battle raged through the night, but by dawn the desert was quiet again. When they finally emerged from their sanctuary, they found the slavers' camp abandoned except for one figure sitting cross-legged by the cold ashes of their fire. Joseph Crow. Feather looked up as they approached, and Silas could see that the man had found something in the darkness that he'd been searching for his entire life. "They're gone," he said simply. "All of them. The desert has claimed what belongs to the desert." He stood, gathering his weapons with the fluid grace of a man who had remembered what it meant to be Apache. "There is a place," he said to Ayanna. 2 days' ride north. Your uncle lives there with others who have escaped the reservation. They will welcome you." "And what will you do?" she asked. "What I should have done years ago. Go home. Make peace with the ghosts of my ancestors. Try to live the rest of my life like a man instead of a hunting dog." He mounted his horse and turned north, then paused to look back at them. "Be careful," he said. "The world is still a dangerous place for people like us. But maybe, if we're lucky, We can find small corners of it where love is stronger than hate." With that, he rode away into the morning light, leaving Silas and Ayanna alone with their hopes and the long road that still stretched ahead of them. But for the first time since their journey began, that road seemed to lead somewhere worth going. They found the Apache camp 2 days later, hidden in a box canyon so remote and well-concealed that Silas would have ridden past it a dozen times without noticing the narrow entrance cut into the rock wall. Joseph Crowfeather's directions had been precise. Follow the dry riverbed north until you reach the standing stones. Then look for the eagle carved into the cliff face. The passage behind it would lead to sanctuary. But sanctuary, Silas discovered, was a relative term. The camp consisted of perhaps 30 people, mostly women, children, and older men, with only a handful of warriors of fighting age. They lived in traditional wickiups made of brush and hide, scattered around a small spring that provided barely enough water for survival. These were the remnants, the survivors, the ones who had slipped through the army's nets and refused to submit to life on the reservation. They were also among the most suspicious people Silas had ever encountered. The moment he and Ayanna rode into the canyon, they were surrounded by armed men who materialized from the rocks like ghosts. Rifles and bows were trained on them from multiple directions, and the tension in the air was so thick it could have been cut with a knife. "Stop there," commanded a voice in accented English. An elderly Apache man stepped forward from the group of warriors. He was perhaps 60 years old, his long gray hair braided with feathers and beads, his weathered face marked by the deep lines that come from a lifetime of squinting into desert sun and wind. Despite his age, he moved with the fluid grace of a trained fighter, and his dark eyes missed nothing as they swept over the two riders. "I am Chief Manuel Elk Runner," he said formally. "Who are you, and what brings a white man to our hidden place?" Before Silas could speak, Ayanna slid down from their horse and walked forward with her hands clearly visible and empty. When she spoke, it was in rapid Apache, her voice carrying the cadence of someone who had grown up speaking the language. The words flowed like music, rising and falling in emotional peaks that Silas couldn't understand but could feel in his bones. The effect on the gathered Apache was immediate and dramatic. Several of the women gasped and pressed their hands to their mouths. One of the warriors lowered his rifle and stared at Ayanna as if he were seeing a spirit, and Chief Elk Runner's stern expression cracked like ice in spring sunshine. "Ayanna," he breathed. "Little Blossom, but you were captured. We heard you were sold to the Mexicans." "Uncle," she replied, tears streaming down her face as she ran to embrace him. "I thought you were dead. They told me all our family had been killed at Sand Creek." "Not all," the old chief said, holding her tightly. "Not all. My child, your cousin Thomas lives, and your grandmother's sister, and several others. We are few, but we survive." The reunion was emotional beyond words. People Ayanna had thought dead for years emerged from the wickiups to touch her face, to confirm that she was real and not some desert mirage born of longing and desperation. There was weeping and laughter, prayers of thanksgiving and cries of joy that echoed off the canyon walls. But through it all, Silas remained mounted and apart, increasingly aware that his presence was like a thorn in the side of this joyous reunion. The Apache warriors had not lowered their weapons, and their eyes never left him. He was the outsider here, the representative of a race that had brought nothing but death and suffering to these people. Finally, Chief Elk Runner turned his attention back to the white man who had brought his niece home. "And you," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "What is your part in this story?" "He saved me," Ayanna said quickly, before Silas could speak. "He bought me from the slavers and set me free. He brought me here so I could find my people." "A white man who helps Apache?" The chief's tone was deeply skeptical. "Forgive me if I find this difficult to believe. What does he want in return?" The question hung in the desert air like smoke from a signal fire. Silas dismounted slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening, then walked forward until he stood beside Ayanna. "Nothing," he said simply. "I want nothing except to see her safe and free." "Nothing?" Chief Elk Runner's eyes were sharp as obsidian blades. White men always want something. Land, gold, women, power. There is always a price. Not this time. One of the younger warriors, a man perhaps 30 years old with the build of a born fighter, stepped forward with his rifle still raised. "This is Thomas White Eagle," Ayanna said quietly. "My cousin." Thomas White Eagle studied Silas with undisguised hostility. "You expect us to believe that a white soldier, yes, I can see the soldier in your bearing, spent his own money to buy an Apache woman and then brought her here out of the goodness of his heart?" "I'm not a soldier anymore," Silas replied evenly. "And I didn't bring her here out of goodness. I brought her here because I love her." The words fell into the gathering like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples of shock and disbelief through the assembled Apache. Several people gasped. Others muttered in their own language. And Silas didn't need a translation to know the comments weren't friendly. "Love?" Thomas White Eagle's voice was thick with contempt. "A white man cannot love an Apache woman. He can own her, use her, discard her when he tires of her. But love? That requires a heart, and white men have no hearts." "Thomas," Ayanna said sharply, "that's enough." "Is it? Is it enough?" Her cousin's voice rose with years of accumulated rage and grief. "Do you know what happened after you were taken? Do you know how many of our people died trying to find you? How many warriors threw away their lives in raids against the slavers who took you?" "I know," she said quietly, "and I grieve for every one of them. But that's not his fault." She gestured toward Silas. "He's not responsible for what others did. He's white." Thomas spat. "That makes him responsible for all of it." The crowd murmured agreement, and Silas could feel the hostility rising around him like floodwater. These people had been pushed beyond the breaking point by decades of broken treaties, stolen land, and casual murder disguised as policy. They had every right to their anger, every justification for their hatred. But Chief Elk Runner raised his hand for silence, and the canyon fell quiet except for the whisper of wind through the rocks. "Ayanna," he said formally, "you are my brother's daughter, blood of my blood, and you are welcome here always. This is your home, your people, your place in the world." He paused, his eyes moving to Silas. "But him, he cannot stay. It is impossible." "Why?" Ayanna's voice was steady, but Silas could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands clenched into fists. "Because he is white, and we are Apache. Because his people have sworn to destroy us, and our people have sworn to resist them. Because there can be no peace between wolf and sheep, no understanding between fire and water." "He's not his people," Ayanna protested. "He's just a man, a good man who risked everything to help me." "One man, yes," the chief agreed. "But what of the soldiers who will come looking for him? What of the settlers who will follow his trail? What of the government that will use his presence here as an excuse to send the cavalry against us?" It was a fair point, and Silas knew it. His presence here endangered everyone in the camp, no matter how good his intentions might be. "I understand," he said quietly. "I'll go." "No." Ayanna turned to face him, her eyes blazing with desperate determination. "You're not going anywhere without me. Ayanna." "No," she repeated firmly. "I've spent too many years being told what I can and cannot do, who I can and cannot love. I won't accept it from anyone anymore, not even my own family." She turned to address her uncle and the assembled crowd, speaking in Apache at first, then switching to English so Silas could understand. "You say he's white and I'm Apache, and therefore we cannot be together. But I say love doesn't recognize the color of skin or the blood in our veins. I say that in a world full of hatred and violence. Two people who choose to care for each other are precious, no matter where they come from." "It's not that simple," Chief Elk Runner said sadly. "I wish it were, child, but it's not. The world will not accept such a union. Society will." "Society?" Ayanna laughed, but there was no humor in it. "What society? The white society that sold me like cattle? The Apache society that couldn't protect me from being taken? I owe nothing to either one." Thomas White Eagle stepped forward again, his face dark with anger. "You would abandon your people for this white man?" "I would choose my own path instead of letting others choose it for me." she replied. "There's a difference." The argument that followed was conducted mostly in Apache, with voices rising and falling in passionate debate. Silas stood apart, understanding little of the words but comprehending perfectly the emotions behind them: anger, fear, love, desperation, and the terrible pain that comes from being forced to choose between family and heart. Finally, Chief Elk Runner raised his hand again, and silence fell. "Ayana," he said, his voice heavy with sorrow, "if you choose him over us, you choose exile. You can never return here. You will be dead to your people. Your name will never be spoken. Your children will not know their heritage. Is this white man worth such a price?" For a long moment, she stood perfectly still, her face a mask that revealed nothing of the turmoil Silas knew must be raging inside her. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady and sure. "His name is Silas," she said. "And yes, he is worth any price." The words hit the gathering like a physical blow. Several women began to weep. Thomas White Eagle turned away in disgust. Even Chief Elk Runner seemed to age a decade in the space of a heartbeat. "Then you are no longer my niece," he said quietly, "and he is no longer welcome in this place. Go, both of you, before the sun sets, and may whatever gods you pray to have mercy on your souls, because your people will not." The exodus from the canyon was conducted in terrible silence. No one spoke as Ayana gathered her few possessions. No one offered food or water for their journey. She was being erased, written out of the story of her people as if she had never existed. But as they rode toward the narrow entrance, Silas saw an elderly woman step out from behind one of the wickiups. She was ancient, her face so lined with age it looked like carved wood, her back bent with the weight of decades. She pressed something into Ayana's hand as they passed, a small leather pouch that chinked softly with the sound of coins. "For your children," she whispered in English, "so they will know they had a grandmother who loved them." Then they were through the entrance and back in the vast emptiness of the desert. Two souls cast out from paradise and left to make their own way in a world that had no place for them. "I'm sorry," Silas said when they were far enough away that the words couldn't carry back to the canyon. "Don't be," Ayana replied, though he could see the tears streaming down her face. "They gave me a choice, and I made it. I chose love over law, heart over blood." She looked at him then, and her smile was radiant despite her tears. "I chose you. Where will we go?" "I don't know," she admitted. "Somewhere we can be together without anyone telling us it's impossible. Somewhere we can build something new instead of trying to fit into something old." They rode north as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Behind them lay the canyon and the people who had cast them out. Ahead lay only uncertainty and the vast, indifferent wilderness. But they rode toward it together, and for now, that was enough. 3 years later, in the high country of Colorado Territory, where the mountains touched the sky and winter came early to stay late, Silas Boone woke to the sound of a child's laughter echoing through the morning air. He lay still for a moment, savoring the sound that had become the most beautiful music in his world. Through the single window of their cabin, he could see snow falling in fat, lazy flakes, the first storm of what promised to be a hard winter. But inside their small sanctuary, warmth radiated from the stone fireplace he'd built with his own hands, and the scent of coffee and frying bacon told him that Ayana was already up and preparing breakfast. The past 3 years had not been easy. After leaving the Apache camp, they had wandered for months through the wilderness of New Mexico and Colorado, searching for a place remote enough that the world's prejudices couldn't reach them. They had endured suspicion in the few settlements they'd encountered, been refused service at trading posts, and more than once been forced to defend themselves against men who believed that an Apache woman traveling with a white man was fair game for whatever violence they cared to inflict. But they had also found unexpected allies. A Ute chief named Running Bear, who had given them shelter during a blizzard and shared his knowledge of the high country. A grizzled mountain man called Old Pete, who had sold them supplies and asked no questions about their past. A handful of other outcasts and misfits who understood that sometimes society's rejects had to create their own communities in the spaces between civilized places. Eventually, they had found this valley, a hidden basin surrounded by peaks so steep and treacherous that only the most determined souls could reach it. There was good water from a spring that never froze, timber for building, and game enough to sustain a small family through the long winters. It was isolated, difficult, and utterly perfect for two people who had been cast out from the world below. "Papa Silas! Papa Silas! Come see!" The voice belonged to Daniel Running Wolf, though that wasn't the name they'd given him when they'd found him 3 winters ago. He'd been called simply the boy then, a half-Apache, half-Mexican child of perhaps 4 years old who had been wandering alone through the mountains, half dead from cold and starvation. His parents had died in a cavalry raid, his extended family scattered to the winds, and he had been surviving on berries and whatever scraps he could scavenge. Ayanna had wanted to keep him the moment she saw him. Silas, more practical but no less moved by the child's plight, had worried about their ability to provide for 3 people in such a harsh environment. But the boy had settled into their lives as naturally as if he'd always belonged there, and now Silas couldn't imagine their family without him. "What is it, son?" Silas called, pulling on his boots and heavy coat. "Snow bears! Big snow bears in the yard." Silas stepped outside into the crisp morning air and immediately saw what had captured the boy's imagination. During the night, the wind had sculpted the fresh snowfall into fantastic shapes, drifts that did indeed look like crouching bears, sleeping deer, and other woodland creatures frozen in white perfection. "They came to visit while we were sleeping," Daniel declared solemnly, his breath puffing in small clouds as he spoke. "Mama Ayanna says the snow spirit sent them to guard our house." "Did she now?" Silas ruffled the boy's dark hair, marveling at how quickly children could accept magic as simply another part of the natural world. Ayanna appeared in the doorway, her face glowing with the special radiance that had been growing stronger over the past few months. At 35, she was even more beautiful than she had been when he first met her, not despite the hardships they'd endured, but because of them. The years had carved away everything soft and superficial, leaving only the essential strength and grace that made her who she was. "Breakfast is ready," she said, smiling at the sight of her 2 men standing among the snow sculptures. "And I have news." Something in her tone made Silas look at her more carefully. There was excitement in her voice, anticipation mixed with a nervousness that was unusual for someone who had faced down slavers and desert storms with equal composure. "What kind of news?" She walked over to him, took his hands in hers, and placed them gently on her still flat belly. "The kind that changes everything," she said softly. It took a moment for the implications to penetrate his consciousness. When they did, he felt as if the mountain itself had shifted beneath his feet. "Are you certain? As certain as a woman can be about such things. The baby should come with the spring thaw." Silas stared at her, overwhelmed by a mixture of joy, terror, and wonder that left him temporarily speechless. A baby, their baby, a new life created from their love, to be raised in this hidden valley far from the hatred and prejudice that had driven them here. "Is this good news or bad news?" Daniel asked, studying the adults with the solemn perception of a child who had learned early to read the emotional currents around him. "The best news," Silas managed, finding his voice at last. "The very best news in the world." The winter that followed was the harshest they had yet endured in their mountain refuge. Snow fell in quantities that seemed biblical in their magnitude, and for weeks at a time they were completely cut off from the outside world. But inside their cabin, lit by firelight and warmed by love, it felt like the coziest place on earth. Silas spent the long evenings building a cradle from mountain pine, carving small animals and birds to hang above it, a mobile that would help their child learn to appreciate the beauty of the wilderness world they were being born into. Ayanna sewed tiny clothes from soft deer hide and wool she had traded for at a Ute camp the previous summer, her face serene with the ancient contentment of women preparing for new life. "Daniel, Initially uncertain about what a baby might mean for his place in their small family, gradually warmed to the idea of becoming a big brother. He began collecting interesting rocks and feathers to show the baby when it arrived, and insisted on helping with every aspect of the preparations. "Will the baby be Apache like Mama Ayana?" he asked one evening as they sat around the fire. "Partly," Silas said carefully, "and partly like me, but mostly, the baby will be like itself, something new and special that's never existed before. Like me, exactly like you." The birth came in early April, during a brief warm spell that melted enough snow to reveal patches of new grass and the first tentative wildflowers. Ayana labored through a long night with only Silas and Daniel to help her. There were no doctors or midwives in their hidden world, just the ancient knowledge passed down through generations of women who had given birth in difficult places. When the baby finally arrived with the dawn, it was a girl, small and perfect and absolutely furious at having been disturbed from the warm darkness of the womb. She had her mother's dark hair and her father's gray eyes, and when she wrapped her tiny fingers around Silas's thumb, he felt his heart expand to accommodate a love he had never imagined possible. "What will we call her?" he asked as Ayana nursed their daughter for the first time. "Hope," Ayana said without hesitation. "In English and in Apache, Itzel, because she is our hope for the future, our proof that love can create something beautiful even in the hardest places." Hope Itzel Boone grew like a wildflower in their mountain valley, tough and resilient and utterly at home in the wilderness. By her first birthday, she was toddling around the cabin and yard with the fearless confidence of someone who had never known that the world could be anything but loving and safe. Daniel appointed himself her protector and teacher, showing her how to identify animal tracks, how to find the sweetest berries, how to listen to the songs of the birds. As the seasons turned and their family settled into the rhythms of their isolated life, Silas found himself thinking less and less about the world they had left behind. The anger and bitterness that had driven him for so many years gradually faded, replaced by a deep contentment he had never expected to find again. Here, in this hidden place, race and politics and all the artificial divisions that men created to justify their hatred seemed as distant and irrelevant as fairy tales. One evening in late summer, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the peaks in shades of gold and crimson, Ayana asked him the question that had been unspoken between them for months. "Do you ever regret it? Leaving everything behind? Choosing this life?" Silas considered the question seriously, as he always did when she asked him something important. He thought about the cabin they had built together, the children they were raising, the quiet satisfaction of days filled with meaningful work. He thought about the nights when they lay together listening to the wind in the pines and the distant howl of wolves, feeling more connected to each other and to the natural world than he had ever felt to civilization. "I regret that it took me so long to find you," he said finally. "I regret the years I wasted being angry at the world. But this, our life together, our family, this place we've made, I wouldn't trade it for anything." "Not even for acceptance? For the chance to walk through a town without people staring and whispering?" "No," he said firmly. "Because acceptance from people who can't see past the color of our skin isn't worth having, and the people whose acceptance might actually matter, the ones with wisdom and open hearts, they would understand that love is love, regardless of where it grows." She smiled and took his hand, intertwining their fingers as they had done countless times since that first night in the storm cave years ago. "I used to dream of my people accepting you," she admitted, "of finding a way to bridge the gap between our worlds. But now I think maybe we've done something better. We've created our own world, where the only laws are the ones we choose to live by." "And what laws are those?" "Kindness, courage, taking care of each other and the land that sustains us, teaching our children to be strong and gentle, brave and compassionate." She gestured toward the cabin, where they could hear Daniel reading a story to Hope in the mixture of English and Apache that had become their family's private language. "These are good laws to live by." "The best," Silas agreed, as if summoned by their words. Daniel appeared in the doorway with Hope on his shoulders. both children laughing at some private joke. In the golden light of evening, they looked like spirits of joy made manifest, proof that love could indeed triumph over hatred, that two broken people could create something whole and beautiful together. "Papa Silas, Mama Ayana," Daniel called. "Hope wants to hear the story about how you first met, the one with the auction and the bad men and the desert adventure." "Again?" Ayana laughed. "She's too young to understand most of it. She likes the voices you make." Daniel explained seriously. "And I think she knows it's a story about how our family began." So they gathered in the cabin as the stars emerged overhead, and Ayana told once again the tale of a broken soldier and a captive woman who found freedom in each other's arms. She spoke of long journeys through dangerous lands, of love growing slowly in the spaces between hatred and fear, of the courage it takes to choose your own path when the world insists you follow the roads it has laid out for you. It was a story they would tell many times over the years, to their children and eventually to their children's children, a reminder that in a world often divided by fear and prejudice, love could still find a way to build bridges across any divide. And in their hidden valley, surrounded by peaks that touched the sky and sustained by a love that had proven stronger than every force that tried to destroy it, they lived as they had chosen to live, free, together, and unafraid of whatever tomorrow might bring. Thank you for listening to this tale of love conquering the impossible odds in the wild American frontier. I hope Silas and Ayana's story touched your heart as much as it did mine. Please let me know in the comments where you're listening from. I'd love to hear from fellow adventurers around the world. Don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Campfire for more stories of courage, romance, and redemption from the untamed frontier. Share your thoughts about this story and let me know what other tales from the Old West you'd like to hear around our virtual campfire.